Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Klauser, with the Center Square's Washington State Capitol correspondent, Carlene Johnson, here to talk about two initiatives heading to the state legislature and then potentially out to voters in the near future, run by Let's Go Washington, a think tank or organization that ran several initiatives in the past, with some of those being successful. Carlene's covered this extensively. Carlene, why don't you tell us a little bit about the initiatives that were forwarded earlier this week and how they could change the state?
Yeah, this has been, months in the works and kind of waiting to see how it was going to boil down. I think most of us knew that Let's Go Washington and founder Brian Heywood were going to do something to try and rectify the fact that state lawmakers passed House Bill 1296 during the 2025 legislative session. And what it basically did was completely gut the Parents' Bill of Rights under Initiative 2081, which lawmakers had adopted a year before. Backing up to the signature gathering for 2081, some folks watching this may recall there was a court fight over language for the initiative, what the title should be, and opponents were able to hold it up in the courts such that, Let's Go Washington only had a matter of about 5.5 weeks to gather signatures before the deadline to get it qualified.
And that's like 300,000 plus signatures, right, Carlene?
It ended up being, they needed it, because it's always based on the number of signatures that you need to qualify these initiatives is based on a percentage of how many voters, what turnout was like in the most recent general election, right? So it can't be like a special election or something like that. It has to be, the most recent general election, and a percentage of that turnout is what is required. But you always want a cushion, right, of more. So in the case of 2081, when Let's Go Washington and supporters were out gathering signatures, I think it was something like 456,000. It was the second most signatures gathered in the shortest amount of time in Washington state history. So, as you and I have talked about before, this is kind of an 80-20 issue, not really a partisan issue. When you ask people, should you as a parent know what's going on with your kids at school? Should you have access to their records at school, their educational records, their mental health records, know if they're seeing a counselor? Parents are going to, by and large, say yes, absolutely. And so 2081 was adopted by lawmakers because they knew if it went to voters, it was going to pass. They came back then this legislative session and passed HB 1296, which not only completely undid 2081, but it went even further. So that's what Let's Go Washington is responding to with this new initiative to restore basically what 2081 originally implemented.
And 1296, I know supporters were essentially saying, look, this isn't about taking away parents' rights. It's about student privacy. But essentially what it did is it made these schools have to jump through several hoops and go through this process before reporting things to parents or making that known. Not to say, and Brian Heywood, I believe, told you this, he's not mad at the teachers for doing this, but it sets up a situation where bad actors could potentially use that process to avoid telling parents things. And the second initiative that they're pushing coming up was regarding protecting girls' sports, particularly trying to keep people who are biologically male and biologically female in their respective categories for sports. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the 1296 issue, which like a lot of with Initiative 2081 in the first place, it's responding to a lot of the policies in recent years regarding transgender athletes competing against biological females, using female restrooms, sort of the gender policies that are seemingly pushed on students as early as kindergarten now. So it kind of seems common sense. And you mentioned it being an 80-20 issue. What kind of happened last session that kind of pushed 1296 forward despite the overwhelming support for 2081 the year before?
The imbalance basically in Olympia. I mean, you've got near super majorities, right, for our Democrats. And so Republicans were powerless to stop it. There was a couple of huge parents' rights rallies where folks showed up. I was getting tons of emails, not just from conservatives and Republicans, but from like Kitsap County Democrats, Pierce County Democrats were reaching out to me saying, this is not a partisan issue. If something's going on with my kid at school, I want to know. And especially, my goodness, if you've got a 10, 11, 12-year-old who's going to a counselor at school and saying, I'm a little confused about my gender, if a school has a right then to not only counsel them to perhaps promote that trajectory, whether that's going to start with medication or, consult with doctor about potential surgical changes. And I, as a parent, don't know. I mean, that makes me crazy to imagine. And so it really isn't a partisan issue. I mean, you've got a baby girl. She's a little bit from school yet, but can you imagine, some years down the line when she's in the public education system and someone counseling her? And it's not to sort of disparage anyone that might be experiencing real gender dysphoria or confusion about that. I mean, we've fed that in society. And so a lot of kids have been questioning it. But if somebody's pushing my kid along that pathway without my knowledge, I think that's where people said, no way. This can't be. And they went even further with 1296, Tim. There were some amendments added by the majority Democrats that made it even more insulting, according to what Heywood told me, and more potentially damaging. One of the things it did was school districts that refused to comply, and there have been, I think right now, 9 to 12 districts in the state that have said, forget it, OSPI, Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, whatever you say, we're not going along with this because our constituents, our district doesn't agree with what you're doing. And we've got Trump in office now, right, who says you can't do this. But one of the things it did was it allows Chris Rakedahl, our superintendent, to withhold state funding. It's specifically written into HB 1296 that districts that do not comply are at risk of losing tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in state funding for noncompliance. And teachers who also don't comply could lose their certificate to teach.
I think that's really going to be the rallying cry for these new initiatives heading into the upcoming cycle is that, with 1296, even if you're not a parent, state and federal taxpayers are paying for our education system and the federal government is brunting a lot of those costs. And if OSPI has the authority to withhold state funding because you're not complying with state policies that right now directly interfere with the president's own orders, I mean, you're essentially putting all these state taxpayers at risk of losing millions and millions and millions of dollars in federal funding that they would have to then backfill by raising fees and taxes in Washington further than they already have with the $9 billion in the most recent session. Yeah,
absolutely. And the protecting girls in sports, that the second initiative from Let's Go Washington. You're right. We've got DOJ, U.S. Department of Education coming down on OSPI and investigating and, saying you will comply. You've got Rakedahl saying, we will not comply. So that one's going to be interesting. But the way the initiative to protect girls in sports is crafted, according to what Brian Heywood told me, it's kind of interesting because basically it says, okay, any kid who participates in middle school, high school sports has to go to the doctor and get a sports physical, right? And on that sports physical, your doctor is going to notate if you are male or female, biologically male or female. That is still on there. It's still part of the physical that you then have to turn in so that you can qualify to participate in athletics. Basically says that the schools have to look at that, and whatever it says, if it says you're biological male, you can't play girls volleyball. You can't play girls softball, and vice versa. That's what the initiative says.
Yeah. Again, I really think this is going to come down to an 80-20 issue with this initiative as well. It's like, I know Washington State, Maine, and a few others have pushed these policies that allow transgender athletes to compete in sports in the effort of inclusivity. But I mean, the vast majority of parents, I feel like, are going to come out and say, look, this isn't fair to our daughters who are going after scholarships, who are going after these opportunities, and then are having it stolen from, say, a student who a year or or two ago was competing against males and maybe would have been, in terms of the state rankings, hundreds below the top spot. And now they're placing first at state. I mean, I think it'll be clear to voters when these do pop up on the ballot.
Well, we'll see too, because first there are initiatives to the legislature. Important to make that clear. They'll go to lawmakers. Lawmakers can decide to punt them and put them to the ballot. I have a feeling that lawmakers will probably take up both of these, knowing, as you said, these are 80-20 issues. And so they might try to take them up and nuance them a little bit, pass some version of them, potentially come back and get them again a year later. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what lawmakers do, because they see the polling. You know, they talk to their own constituents. So they know what public opinion is on both of these. And I don't think Let's Go Washington and supporters are going to have any problem getting enough signatures to qualify both of them, such that, you know, lawmakers are going to have to figure out how to proceed from there.
Yeah. And before we close, kind of walk us through that process moving forward. Can the state lawmakers just say, hey, we're going to pass these, or hey, you don't need to gather signatures, we're just going to put it on the ballot? Or how many signatures would Let's Go Washington need to raise based off last year's general election?
That's a really good question. So based on the last general election, what both measures need individually is about 309,000 valid voter signatures. They're going for more than 400,000 for both, just to ensure that cushion. Some duplicates, some people that maybe aren't registered voters but want to sign anyway, whatever. So that's that. I'm told the goal is 400,000 for both, 309,000 to qualify. And, they're going to try and get this done by, I think, the first week of December. So at this point, they've got plenty of time to make that happen. You can also, a lot of people wanted less time to you do the signature gathering on their own rather than, you know, find a paid signature gatherer outside Safeway. So you can go to the Let's Go Washington website and, you know, download your own petitions, or just put your mailing address in there and they'll send you some petitions. You can gather them at church, your neighbors or whatever. Or, you know, I mean, if folks that are opposed, this is their opportunity as well to sort of influence their neighbors and friends and, you know, explain to people why they don't think they should sign. But my sense is they're not going to have any trouble getting this qualified. It's going to initially be up to lawmakers. And if they punt on it, then it goes to voters.
And assuming everything goes to plan for the initiative backers, when would be the soonest that voters do see this on the ballot if it ends up that way? Would it be this coming August, in November, or the year after? It
would be the following year, right? Because lawmakers for 2026 would have the opportunity to consider both and decide what to do. If they do nothing, then those would go to the next general election ballot. So it would be November of 26, most likely, I'm told, when voters would have an opportunity to weigh in on this. But the juicy part, and the part that I get a front seat row for, is during the 26th legislative session, when we get to see how lawmakers are going to respond or not. And I promise we'll be there to cover all of it.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see what happens, especially how the majority party responds to these, considering them telling you that they thought whatever Let's Go Washington would push would be a waste of time and would definitely fail at the ballot.
They told me.
Time will only tell, but Carlene, we appreciate you covering this. And for others wanting to catch Carlene's coverage, you can see that at thecentersquare.com. But otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.